Greetings. I am now with Nancy Gilbert over in British Columbia. And again, it's 1 in the afternoon here and it's wine time. Now, Nancy, it's at 4 in British Columbia, I understand. And it's almost wine time, but keeping up with that British kind of tradition, you've got your tea, I understand.
Got my
So
tea.
I have heard of Nancy's name for a long time in my work. Usually it's always around Bob Wobenow, all things. I mean, Bob Wobenow's name, I hear Nancy Gilbert's name and all that stuff. So I know she's been involved in doing wash rag projects for a while. So I'm just going to turn this over to her. She's got a lot to talk about, and we'll have a Q&A afterwards. So without further ado, Nancy, the podium is yours.
Oh, thank you very much. Well, I thought I'd kind of start at the beginning of my Rotary experience because that's actually pretty closely tied to how I got into WASH. People often talk about how, you can't join a Rotary Club if you're not invited, and it's really true. And many clubs have somebody who's a star at inviting other people. I was in a little town in New Brunswick in the east coast of Canada, and the Rotary Club of Sackville had one of those people, this fellow, Ova Samuelson. He was a lawyer in town, but he was just a pro at getting people to join the club because he'd invite you, and then he'd invite you again, and then he'd call you again the morning of the meeting. And I mean, he'd just keep at you. And so I started to go and discover this whole world of these wonderful, many of them older, frankly, but wonderful people who I never would have gotten to know if I hadn't joined Rotary. And Rotary ended up changing my life because it was through Rotary that I discovered water, sanitation, and hygiene. I am a lawyer by profession. I was working at the time in an advertising agency. We had a marketing communications and company in a little town, but with technology, we were working with big clients in Toronto and other parts of the world. Rotary just sort of fit this lovely gap in my life. I became the club president. I led a GSC team to India. That was a huge eye-opener. We got involved in the youth exchange program. My husband and I have 7 children between us. 5 of them have done youth exchange, and we have hosted about 14 students over the years, and just it added enormous richness to our lives. And for each of our students our kids who each went to different countries, we visited them and got to know their host families and clubs. And one of those students who's a real favorite was from South Africa. And visiting her father, who was a Rotarian, he took us to these absolutely appalling situations. Schools that were, under a tree or in a tin shack with no toilets, no running water. It just was a shock to a, woman from New Brunswick in Canada who had no idea that people had to suffer like that in the world. Well, life continued, and as I say, I became district governor, and then I worked at the zone level. But my interest in WASH was really piqued, and I began to self-teach. Got very involved in various projects, and then met Ron Denham, who I fondly think of as our, energizer bunny in WASREG, and began working very closely with him. At that point, we had moved to Toronto, which is where Ron lives, and Anna. It's kind of action central for WASREG, or certainly was. So I had the privilege of working very closely with them for quite a few years and working on the marketing communications side, on projects, managing Washington Schools program for WASREG, just a whole variety of things. I also, through that experience, was invited to go to a meeting in Boulder, Colorado with Kathy Leslie, who's the head of Engineers Without Borders. Ron and I were there, and there was a fellow there from an organization called PIND, Partnership Initiatives in the Niger Delta. They were setting up an NGO in the Niger Delta with funding from Chevron. Chevron had put up $50 million for the first 5 years of their operations. And they were focused on economic development, peace building, advocacy and research, and capacity building. WASREG was brought in to get involved in doing water and sanitation consulting with them, but in the end, what they really needed was someone to develop their appropriate technology program. And so they ended up contracting me to do that. And I worked with PIND for 6 years in total, Most of that in the Niger Delta. I was commuting back and forth from Canada. It was an absolutely unbelievable experience. I think truly it's difficult to understand water, sanitation, hygiene if you don't spend time in the field, or at least a certain amount of time in the field, because the reality of trying to work in a developing region is like nothing we experience in the West. Just things you would never think would be a problem are a huge problem. People come from such different cultural backgrounds, education levels, aspirations, social norms, I mean, all of this kind of thing. So I just learned an absolute ton during the time that I was working there. In the Niger Delta is 9 states in the south of Nigeria. It's where the Niger River comes down through Nigeria out to the Atlantic Ocean. So it's a huge delta. At sea level, you have 2,400 to 4,000 millimeters of rain a year, dotted with mangrove forests and little villages, and 30 million people live in that region. Open defecation is rampant. Water quality is very poor. Lots of disease, lots of violence. I mean, just a myriad of problems, most of which I think were exacerbated by the presence of the oil industry and the development of the oil industry, sadly, despite some companies' efforts to mitigate the situation. I was really baffled by why the situation was so bad in Nigeria. Nigeria, when I started, it was the time of the MDGs, and Nigeria from the 90s to 2015 actually went backwards. Things got worse, not better. I mean, it's stunning. And that you have a country that's 180 million people. For a stretch there, it was the largest economy in Africa. It's absolutely mind-boggling. So one of the other things I did during that time was decided to do a doctorate. And my topic was improving sanitation in the Niger Delta. So I did qualitative research and completed my doctorate this year. It was really an eye-opener. I went to Royal Roads, which is an applied program, and it was a fabulous excuse as an older person to go back to school and actually learn how to do academic research properly, understand that you don't have to go to the library and open books anymore. Everything's online. But I learned so much through that process and realized that, in fact, there are some pretty basic issues that need to be addressed if we're going to improve sanitation in a region like that. As I was ending my time in Nigeria, a group of mostly WASRAG colleagues got together and they said, look, how can we leverage what you've learned over the last 6 years? They had similar experiences, not in terms of content, but in terms of kind of where it took their thinking, that if we really want to address the issue of sustainability in WASH, or in fact in any other area of development, we really need to focus on building local capacity. My research told me that people in villages who wanted to improve things had no idea what to do. They didn't know where to go to get information or guidance. They didn't know where to go to get basic training on different things. You see development organizations in the field, they often work in silos. It's rare to see them talking to one another and actually sharing experiences and knowledge. And we so often repeat the same mistakes. At Transform, which is the organization I'm with now, we have a phrase I borrow from Susan Davis, who has an organization called Improve International. And Susan talks about knowledge into practice. How do you take the knowledge that's in one person's head and actually get it into the hands of another? It's a great challenge, and I think if we can crack that one, we're going to make a lot more progress in development. So what we decided to do was create a network of independent in-country centers that could become institutions and resources for their regions. And that's what we've done. So we created something called Transform International. We currently have 8 member centers. We call them CTCs, or Community Transformation Centers. A 9th one has requested membership from Burundi. So we have centers in Bolivia, in the Philippines, Papua New Guinea, Zambia, Malawi, Tanzania, Kenya, and Nigeria. We're working with an extensive group of advisors, and what's been fun for me with the E-Club is actually meeting some new people and bringing some new capability to the table, because, you know, if we all pitch in and help one another, we're going to do a better job. And there's some fabulous resources within our Rotary Club. We've been at it for just over a year. We're struggling, of course, to find funding, which is the perennial challenge that Rotary clubs, them too, but NGOs have. But we've done some good stuff. And let me give you an example. Our Bolivian CTC, the director in Bolivia is actually Amanda Martin, who is a Rotary Peace Scholar. Strong Rotary connections in a lot of this, but Amanda and Penny Nixon, the program director, are just amazing. And so they came to us and said, well, one of the things that they were looking at doing was setting up a circuit rider program, but they kind of didn't know where to start. So we connected with Brima Apamfir at the Desert Research Institute, with the Avena Foundation in South America. We're working on a program for them, and then we will collectively go out and find funding to implement that program. The real beauty of it, though, is they'll have a program that works, but then we can take all those lessons learned and we can share them through the network. And then other member centers can take that learning and adapt it and apply it to their region as makes sense. So, I mean, I could give you tons of other examples of things we're working on, but and mapping, for example, is something that centers have asked about. And so Bruce, you know, had a session with Neil and has brought some other resources to the attention of the club. That's fantastic. Neil's going to do a talk to our core team next week. So, you know, this knowledge sharing to me is absolutely critical for improving our outcomes and our impacts. And I'm pretty excited about it. So that's what I'm doing now. I'm the executive director of Transform International. I am part of the WASH E-Club, trying to, you know, be a good member as best I can. And just actually glad to be in Canada and not be on a plane all the time to Nigeria. Yeah, so there you go.
So I can't help but smile, because it sounds like you and I are paths in Rotary pretty much kind of parallel. I got involved in Rotary Youth Exchange also, as well as water penetration.
Yeah.
It's funny because, you know, you see your fellow club members, they're sort of stuck in that local club mentality, and they're just really flying real close to the trees, and there's a whole different orbit in Rotary. And once you begin to understand the value of Rotary, the networking capacity of Rotary, and doing things, you begin to just find the power of what you do. I couldn't help it. I was just smiling. I was just, oh, you know, Nash and I are pretty much, even down to Ron Denham, you know. I was like, oh,
that's funny. But you're absolutely right. And that was one of the powerful things about the Youth Exchange program, is these small communities in our district in Maine and in New Brunswick who really had no idea what went on in the rest of the world, would host a student from God knows where, and suddenly, you know, bring the world to them and realize this person is a wonderful human being, even if they don't speak their language or have a different culture. And it just opened incredible doors. It's fascinating.
Well, it was also interesting because you started talking about capacity building too, and it's so true. I mean, I usually tell, and you talk about culture, and I always tell my volunteers as they're traveling with me that we all carry baggage. And it's not necessarily the clothes we bring, it's our personal prejudices and all that, but we need to understand the culture. Kind of the stream we're really swimming in to be able to be effective. And a lot of it is really getting a sense of ownership as well as capacity building in that village that we're actually working in. So,
yeah, it's true. That was an interesting exercise we had to do as part of the doctoral training or education, was positionality. You had to do a critical look at your own prejudices and what, you know, where are you looking at things from, and how does that impact what you see and how you interpret knowledge and, you know, might do your research. That was an interesting exercise. I think everybody needs to do that.
The other thing I couldn't help but smile. I think it's because I'm involved in youth exchange. I was a youth exchange coordinator for Latin America. They always talk about culture
Hmm.
and getting culture shock. And again, the same thing. I tell my volunteers that go down to developing countries that you're going to get culture shock. And if you're there for a week, it's probably not just going down and being part of that village because it's kind of like camping. You
Yeah.
get used to the rhythms of that area and all that stuff. The culture shock you get is when you get back and you begin
Yes.
to realize
Oh,
that the things
very true.
you're so worried about, you
Yeah.
know, hygiene issues and taking showers with flip flops or sandals on, all those, or just pace, not being able to get around as much. You get
Yeah.
used to it. Then you come back to the States and it's like it's Oz, it's Disney. It's not reality anymore.
Yeah. And nobody really understands what you've been through.
Right.
So, and they'll say, how was your year? But they don't actually really often want to know. It's funny. It's a tough adjustment for kids to come back. Yeah.
So we were talking about things being different, getting capacity building, and all that stuff. I mean, before we had this conversation, we were on with Bruce and Steve, and we talked about how do you begin to do needs assessment and analysis? I mean, how do you,
Hmm.
rather than trying, which is, by the way, is baggage, rather than trying to shoehorn a technology into a solution to a problem, you
Hmm.
begin to understand the problem itself. So it's what I call problem seeking,
Hmm.
that you begin to understand what the problem is. And that might not only be technological, it could be logistics, it could be an issue about culture, a lot of things that you got to begin to find out. Can you share a little bit about your experience with needs assessment?
Sure. Uh, I completely agree with you that it's critical that you can't. Well, I think the other piece of needs assessment that strikes me as you were talking is inevitably, if you're trying to solve a problem in a community, if the community doesn't take ownership of that problem and really buy into what's happening, you're not going to get anywhere. You can't force things on people. It's just not going to stick. So in a sense, for me, doing a needs assessment is really about not just understanding the lay of the land, but really understanding the people and engaging the people to do the needs assessment with you. You're going to get insights into how the community operates. They're often natural leaders and protocols and all kinds of things that we might not notice at first. It's too easy to walk in and say, oh, they need a well, we'll put it over there. So it's a real exercise in participatory evaluation, and critical to look at things like gender and gender roles and be sensitive to that. Critical, and this is something I really learned well in the Niger Delta, which is such a conflict-prone region. Critical to do a conflict assessment as well, because it's very easy as you develop plans for a project to create conflict inadvertently, either by not understanding the real situation or favoring one group in the community to the exclusion of another. I mean, these things are way more complex than many people realize at first blush.
It's almost like you got to adapt this sense of humility when you go into
Oh,
area.
absolutely.
That you're not the great solution. You're really kind of
Yeah. Yeah.
fitting into the nature of the village itself.
I completely agree. We're not there to solve problems. We're there to help them solve their own problems. And that's really what TI is about too, is how do we build that capacity within the region so that they're equipped to help themselves? Because in the end, that's the only way that's going to work.
Well, again, this discussion's been really good. You pretty much kind of validated. I don't know if we need to have validation. We've been both in the field before. To what's happening, you kind of evolved to this point, right? I mean, you learn by your mistakes.
Absolutely.
So
Absolutely. And that's the key thing, is to learn by those mistakes. There's no point in just doing them over and over and over again, because that's not very helpful.
Well, Nancy, this has been really a lot of fun talking to you. Again, it's very, very educational. It's good to see somebody of your caliber and your depth involved in the I hope that you really get involved. And I'm going to plug your PowerPoint presentation that you're going to be doing? Because I think that as we evolve and all the club members begin to get a sense of being an ambassador for the club and getting a lot of other clubs involved, I think that's kind of where we're going here. And
Yeah.
we all have,
Can I put a plug in for something too? Because we had our 2-day strategy session 2 weeks ago, and one of the things that has become abundantly clear within Transform is we really need some volunteer help as country team leads. So people who have an understanding and knowledge of particular areas, who could be an interface between Transform and a CTC and others working in that region, and ensure that the services and programs that we have available are getting to the right CTC in the right way, and vice versa. Their needs are coming through. And there may be Rotarians who are interested. I mean, some of our country team leads are Rotarians, but there may be people in the club who have a particular passion for a region in the world where we may happen to have a CTC. And I would love if they were interested in getting involved. So just a plug for an opportunity.
That's great. As a matter of fact, you reminded me of something I was thinking about when we were talking. And we need somebody in South America. So if you've got somebody that you know in Bolivia that wants to be a member of the E Club, please.
Well, Amanda might well be interested in joining as a Rotary Peace Scholar.
So now I've got you saying that on a recorded video.
There, you've got me recorded. I will ask her.
Thanks a lot, Nancy. It's nice talking to you.
Nice talking to you too. Have a good, enjoy the rest of that wine.
All right. And you enjoy your tea.
Okay. See
Bye.
you.